just
please go ahead.
Pick things up. All right. Thanks everybody for coming to the second week of Design at Large in the spring quarter. This week our speaker is Ben Bratton. He's an associate professor of visual arts. He's associate professor of visual arts at UCSD. He's the director of the Center for Design and Geopolitics. And to many of you, he may also be famous as the person who gave the talk that made it viral all over the internet. We really need to talk about TED. I read that talk in transcription. I saw that talk on video. So one of the things that's really exciting about Ben is, he has a PhD in sociology. He has he's the faculty coordinator of the MFA program, has an art practice, but he's also engaged in these broader conversations about design in popular culture. And intervening in representations of design and innovation. He also worked with nano-engineers, right? So we're excited to welcome him here today to be part of this conversation of us talking about what does design mean here at the UCSD campus. So with that, I'd like to thank Ben Bratton for coming to speak.
Thank you all for coming. A fair bit to get through with this. Usually put a lot on the table for discussion and then sort of see where it goes. We can throw stuff against the wall, or it has to be something else to be thrown up with the stick on before it'll stick to the wall. So sort of multi-layers of things going on here. Just to sort of begin with, I'll just real quickly. I came here from teaching 10 years at SciArt, Southern California Institute of Architecture. Which is where I went right up to Sociology PhD, strange, as well as Design the Arts at UCLA. But I was also the director of this group at Yahoo called the Advanced Strategies Group, and did a lot of some interesting things there on the, just it ended up being launched by other people, as these things tend to do. But I guess the one thing I want to sort of say is that a lot of my practice sort of moves between academic and professional world here as well. And the reason I say this is because I want to speak to that interplay, or that tension between them as well. And as Lillian mentioned, also director for the Center for Design and Geopolitics here at Cal APT, which is more of a conference series than anything else. This book, The Stack, which just finished for MIT Press, which I'll be pulling a little bit of ideas from as well. This has been the big project for the last year or so, and now I'm starting to go back to this and beyond robotics, social philosophy of synthetic intelligence, and critique of the Turing models. I want to begin by saying some rude things about design, particularly design as it exists in its institutional context. When Don Norman gave his talk over the business school a few weeks ago, he gave two definitions of design at the beginning of this talk, which are, to a certain extent, there's a telling in terms of how they get mixed up. One in which he talked about how design can be thought of as any way in which a culture kind of puts one brick on top of another brick, any logic of material assemblage in relationship to its conceptions of function, mythology, site, place, landscape, and anything. All of this is design in a sort of basic human faculty. The other way which you talk about design is like, this is how design actually works in the real world. Clients, their deliverables, there's usability, there's functions, anything else you're going to screw around with is just kind of play. And these can't both be true. And I want to sort of argue sort of the former a little bit over the latter. And to talk, maybe extending some of my remarks from Ted, to talk about the ways in which certainly the institutional form of design and how it is that our culture, organizing design, has failed us as something, a kind of bad faith utopia, one in which none of us actually believe in, but which we each know none of us believes in these things, but we do them. And one of the ways we think about this is the generic structures and campaigns and design projects and the ways in which they're constructed. It doesn't really matter what problem is posed to design within this model, it's going to fill out the form in exactly the same way, give exactly the same kind of answers. And it's the cynicism of this process that I find most ultimately most destructive. It doesn't really matter what agency you talk to, you're going to get the basics of the message structure here as well. They'll come in and talk to your company, do charrettes with you, everyone knows it's mostly bullshit, everyone knows the boss knows it's mostly bullshit, boss knows you know it's mostly bullshit, and yet we all sort of continue doing it along the way, which is, in a certain sense, a good definition of ideology. Not the things that you do that you're forced to think because you're told to, but the things that you know aren't true but do anyway. Such as. And also, I think we want to at least sort of begin at the ways in which design has become not as a way to remake things in the world, remake the system, but a way to prevent the remaking of things in the world. So a kind of camouflage and alibi for not addressing the real issue. The real issue. It's a way to sort of by proposing a kind of usefulness of design by camouflaging the social destructiveness of the products and services that are being designed in the first place. And one might say, well, look, that's not really design's job. Design is not it's design is design. It's not politics or ethics or policy or any of those things. Those things are good and they need to be dealt with, but that's not really design's job. And I guess I always kind of find it telling when certain defenders of a certain version of the profession are sort of able to happily and neatly announce that the limitations and mistakes of that profession are not the results of how poorly that profession is structured, but because of the failure of the usual list of politicians, philosophers, moralists, congressional oversight, faulty regulators, bad clients, poorly written laws, dumb machines, insurance companies, and so on. It's usually a kind of red flag. And maybe there's a way in which we can talk about probably the problems of the way design has been developed and the way in which design operates are as a certain function of the way in which design actually works. Which, going back to certain objects of persona modeling and understanding structures of societies in terms of personas and the kind of reductive instrumentality of this model, the ways in which people come to act exactly like personas, and the personas become not descriptions of social actors, but engines of forms of social activity in this way. An engine, not a map of the way in which these work together. Branding, of course, is perhaps in a certain way among the most intelligently cynical way in which we deal with this. And certainly have nothing against the idea that complex systems, control economic systems, are at the root of kind of cultural and mythological operation, and we enter into them above that in a sort of way. And I taught a branding course at UCLA for some time, which we were dealing with these issues. So the idea of narrativization of systems is by itself not a problem. We may want to say the way in which design becomes a kind of aspirational form, by which the imagining design, imagining oneself in relationship to design becomes the source of general official class anxiety, normative gender roles, and all the rest of this stuff. Design theory itself is probably to blame for a lot of this too, the way in which it's easily turned into a kind of airport business book sort of discourse, and hopefully we can do a few better things than that. Perhaps the most, to me, kind of the project that sums this up, all of this up to the most, was this charrette that IDEO did with 60 Minutes or something, and the designing of a new shopping cart as the fundamental issue for design to be thinking about and working with. Imagine a horrible dystopic future where great designers, instead of designing the chair, right, all architects design this chair, so they all design the shopping cart, right? Franklin wrote shopping cart, and everyone called it a shopping cart. It's such an awesome dog carrying its own leash as a way of sort of doing this. But of course, IDEO, they came up with a perfectly good shopping cart. Shopping cart are much more what I sort of work with, but as a company that prides itself on being a kind of interdisciplinary systems design, matching software and hardware and all these sort of things together, it's interesting that they came up with this shopping cart and not this shopping cart along the line. But anyway, fortunately there is maybe sort of an eclipse of all of this, and it didn't work. A kind of shift in the way design actually is operating for the better. There's a few bright signals we can look at, and that's really what I'd rather more talk about. With this as well, away from this sort of corporate moment, one in which the result of which would lead us to lead, I think, the same person to think that we need far less design than more of it. And an example of this may be that this work with this a friend of mine named Jan Chipchase, who was at Nokia for a long time. And he did these interesting projects where he would go around the world and he would do charrettes with different people in different locations and ask them what kind of cell phone they would want to have. And they would draw pictures of this cell phone, and they would talk about the kinds of software applications they might like to have on this cell phone. And they would take this back to corporate headquarters and put it in perhaps into functional requirements. to make the cell phone and so forth and so on. All of this is, of course, pre-App Store, pre-platformization of the phone itself, which people like Jan Chase are not really needed in order for people to make the phone into what they want to make the phone. They can simply write the code themselves to make the app to the phone, in which it's supposed to be. It's these kinds of disintermediations that I think are really quite interesting and happening on a lot of different levels, and maybe the kinds of things that move us out of the morass that we're in. We'll include 3D and 4D printing, software and hardware APIs, kind of software isomorphism you especially see in design schools. It used to be you go to design school and you could look at the tools that someone carried and you could tell whether they were a car designer or an interaction designer or a graphic designer or whatever. And now everyone knows the same 7 pieces of software, and it allows you to sort of move between scales and programs and functions in a way that's much more interesting. Not just as a professional designer, but as someone who redesigns the things that they actually want to work with. And all of which I just want to sort of make sure that there isn't kind of misunderstanding. On the one hand, I believe that the economics and the social systems which all this sort of been is a kind of paradoxical situation, and that it is the engines of these market economies that make all of these amazing, fantastic technologies possible, and yet at the same time they're ultimately the things that prevents the full flowering and holding them back. So the argument I'm making is not the sort of we need to put the brakes on all of this and deal with these kinds of handcrafty local. No. It's much more fast forward. It's the kind of timidity, self-defeating, self-hating bad faith in this process that I think is the more egregious issue. Okay. Specifically then to maybe then I'll talk a little bit about the university and then just some other ways of thinking about this and then back to the university again. Most, all disciplines, serious disciplines in university think in a sort of a research and applied model. There's the research that happens where we come up with that we discover genuinely new things, and then maybe that sort of go down the line gets applied in the world in some sort of certain intellectual structure here involved. Of course, in reality, it actually works both ways. What's concerning in a certain way is the way in which design might be understood within a university context, entirely in terms of its application and the way in which it's seen as a way to make research that happens in other disciplines more useful in the world, as opposed to being an independent discipline in its own right. It might actually invent things, have its own kinds of independent epistemologies, ontologies, and projects, and the rest of this, and have its own specific relationship with those kinds of applications. And I would make the argument that for a design, especially at a research university, to have the strongest impact it can have within the state of California or any sort of clientele, it has to develop separate from its application. It has to develop that autonomy in order for it actually to not replicate the same problems over and over that we already sort of find. So maybe there's a way in which we're seeing a kind of shift at this level where there have been large corporate client models of design research where you've got these big R&D groups that do something that maybe gets applied into products or somewhere else or market research. There's a kind of focus on the immediate application of design to specific product life cycles. There's ways in which agencies know how to sell services based on a particular move into this supply and value chain. There's a particular modeling of products and services, like this coming back to Nokia and the rest of it, siloing of knowledge, and a politics of stuff that we may want to do this. We may have these value programs. The best will have a recycling program at the end of the chain. But there's other ways in which this can sort of work and already is working. And I think what we want to look to, especially in terms of scaling up design at a research university, is how platform models of design research, where a Kickstarter campaign becomes market research in its own way. Watching science fiction movies becomes a form of design research. Applied design is about launching quickly, building off centralized platforms in order to, like hosting Amazon Web Services, other APIs, and sort of building things super fast. Or Uber taking the real world and turning it into a kind of software model based on all of the other platforms that are already there. I mean, can you imagine if General Motors or Avis tried to do what Uber did? How long it would have taken, how pathetic it would have been in relationship with it? Or if someone had come to IDEO and said, we'd like to do a project like this, can you invent a system like that? Just how bad the outcome might have been. And similarly for the agency services, there's different places along the pipeline by which the writers and programmers of APIs and other kinds of interventions can work themselves around. Platforms and services operate across multiple scales, different kinds of topologies. And in a certain way, the siloed knowledge becomes less less likely to the extent to which it's possible within these kinds of systems. You're familiar with the 10x engineer, the idea that an engineer who's 10 times better than a regular engineer is actually 100 times more effective and valuable in this as well, right? There's a similar affection, I think, with design, and that more of it does not scale in a certain kind of way. And I think one of the ways in which the platform, this kind of shift towards platform models, allows to, for the work of those designers to become a kind of an on-tap service that other things can pull in, whether it's through an API or through other kinds of products and things. And then, of course, this, different, we can all have different, the ways we can deal with the material constructions of this will all be a little bit different. So, within that research university context, there could be an emphasis on this anthropological logic of design. How it is it that we as a society want to put one brick on top of another brick? How should this work? How might it work? What could we do? How could design operate as a mechanism? And what are the key research problems? And then the institutional outcomes of these things are important, but they're a secondary process. Or we can imagine this a bit differently, in which the immediate design is understood as the kind of immediate translation of things that we already know into the world in such a way that we simply accelerated the process of their transference and lessened the difference between the research university and the research-based design practice. I think clearly the former, in the long term, will be the more valuable and scalable solution, which implies a movement from research question to applied problems as opposed to applied problems to research as well. Okay, real quickly then, what is design? What do we mean when we're talking about design here as well? There's at least four, you can come up with lots more, but there's fewer. People would say, I might ask my little boy with design, they say, well, this box has designs on it, right? Which uses little squiggly, squirrely things and stuff like that. Those are designs that are fine. We can put design as kind of the general designation of systems. There's a nice lecture by Latour called The Cautious Promethea, talking about Peter Sloterdijk. I usually wouldn't recommend Latour. But there's just a very good essay on this logic of design as a kind of macro designation. We talk about the craft of designers, that are designing new ways of making. And we talk about people having designs on something, right? House of Cards, he has designs on the president, right? He's not drawing the president, but he has designs on it nonetheless. And I think it's these two that are in fact the most interesting for us to think about in this regard. The first one may be sort of self-evident. The second one, in a way, I'm drawing on some work of a very interesting fellow, London and Benjain, who's written about design in terms of plots and traps. Design is a kind of trapping. This is sort of setting up a trap in which the user will be caught in just exactly the right way. And he links this to the etymology of plots, which used to be a plot of land, in this as well, and then later became, once that plot was put on a stage, the kind of empty diagrammatic system that would put the actors in motion, regardless of if they thought they were having some kind of free will. The plot got them in the end anyway. The trap of the plot, which is another way in which designers have talked about programming. You program in architecture is the way in which you set up a space so that certain structures and formats of certain behaviors might happen. Software talks about programs in a very sort of similar kind of way. Politics talks about programs in a similar kind of way. There may be a way we want to think about platforms as the kind of conjunction of the plot and the program into a kind of common framework. So what do we mean by platforms? Well, we don't just mean software platforms. We mean any kind of sort of rigid system in which, why its simplicity, rigidity, its dumbness, and its openness actually allows for and organizes extraordinarily dynamic forms of self-directed behavior. An urban grid is a platform. Bentham's panopticon model is a platform. Rem Koolhaas in Delirious New York wrote extensively on the logic of the grid and the way in which it develops particular blocks and plots of land as a platformization of the city. And I've written quite a bit about the logic of platforms in a software hardware context of using the classical OSI model of the platform here. And one of the key things about understanding platform in this context is also its modularity. that you can take anything out of one of these layers and put something else back in, but as long as the thing in that layer can talk to the one below it and above it, the protocols with this as well, this thing can evolve and sort of self-innovate on its own. And as a way of thinking about the complex systems that we want to design in, sort of the composition of the platforms that themselves might generate and become an engine for further activity down the line, that's that modularity and the agnostic quality of the scaling, I think is kind of the key idea to keep in mind. This is why when we pull out copper wire and put in fiber optic at the physical layer of the internet, everything works just fine. It doesn't really matter, and so forth. There's a kind of Theseus's paradox quality of this. If you take the old joke about this is George Washington's original hammer, but we replace the axe and the handle a couple times. It occupies the same space. Proper platforms work in a similar way, that anything can be removed and put back again. And the generativity of it remains in form.
Usually with almost attached.
What's that?
Usually there's an almost.
Almost. At which point in a sentence?
Well, things like you replace copper with fiber optic, and the fact that latencies have gone down usually cause bugs to crop up at some other spot in the system. And
right.
You can usually almost swap the modules, but gremlins appear.
No doubt. Any kind of complex system that it's defined as much by the noise that it generates as the information outcomes it generates. And the interesting part is telling you one from the other, because it's not always so obvious as in the first case. So I think in terms of platforms, let me just sort of speak more specifically. I think it's important to recognize that platforms are not just a technical architecture, but also an institutional form. They can centralize things like states, scaffolding in terms of participation according to these rigid protocols, just as they decentralize like markets, coordinating economies not through the superimposition of fixed plans, but through interoperable and emergent interaction. So perhaps like next to states and markets, platforms can be seen as a third form, coordinating through those fixed protocols while scattering free-range users watched over in loving, if also disconcertingly omniscient grace. In the platform as totality, drawing these interfaces of everyday life into one another, the maximal state and the minimal stage, Red Plenty and Google Ghost Plan, start to look weirdly similar. And I think that there's, in economics and political theory, there's beginning to be a very interesting conversation around platforms and platform logic, particularly in economics and finance, but to the extent to which states begin to move onto the cloud begins to take over more of the functions of the state. A proper political economic theory of platform, or multiple ones, is necessary. Platforms need their Hobbes and their Marx and their Hayek and their Keynes somewhere down the line. For example, I mean, there's no better example of the platformization than the shipping container and the logistical protocols that allow this distribution of objects throughout the world in this way. Okay, so one kind of platform, and I use this really as a kind of somewhere between a technical schema that is a metaphor and a metaphor that is also a technical schema, are stacks. And I use it as kind of way of thinking about computation this way. Instead of thinking about all the different kinds of innovation, computational systems, smart grids, cloud computing, ubiquitous computing, giant addressing systems, augmented realities, non-human users, all these things, there's a bunch of different and disparate developments, all species of computing all on their own. It's possible to imagine them more as a kind of coherent organization, something like a software and hardware stack, an accidental megastructure of sorts. And I think that in conceptualizing these in terms of this totality, it allows for the whole mechanism to take on a composability that it doesn't have otherwise. It allows to see some of the kinds of noise that each one of these layers produce and understand that they are in fact signal of something else that connects it to everybody. And that's the sort of work that it does. So this is one way I think that these kind of platform logics allow for a kind of interpretive and generative idea here as well. I didn't want to show any projects, but I'm going to show a couple in here just for the sake of it. Last week I met the guy who designs all the data centers for Facebook. and talking to him about what this all entails. And really what it's about is energy and water, of course. It's about pulling in massive amounts of energy, massive amounts of water to keep these processors cool. And we were talking about how a lot of you know, there's book 2 is about where the internet actually is. And we were talking about how you go to data centers in order to see the internet, like the internet's in there somewhere. And if we get to it, then we'll have gone to it, and then we can, like the Grand Canyon or something. But we were talking about how the big center in Oregon that he just built is next to the Bonneville Dam, and it's next to the Bonneville Dam because that's powering all of this. And the Bonneville Dam is just as much part of the internet as everything that's inside this building. Those electrons that are coming into the building and powering this whole thing, it's just as much part of this mechanism as everything else. There's a lot of interest in talking about smart grids, of developing ways in which, for rationalizing the distribution of electrons along the ways in which we've done with the internet. And, I think the idea of thinking about electrons as packets has sent a lot of people off in totally the wrong direction. But I mean, one of the things I think to think about with the development of smart grids longer down the line is they themselves are incredibly energy intensive in terms of what the costs of building them and how they're able to sort of work. And there's a way in which they're kind of in a race with themselves. And if you read a lot of the like Greenpeace and other sorts of things on these data centers, some other ones are arguing that the full deployment of ICT will ultimately reduce carbon costs by 3 times what it actually costs. It's kind of in a race with itself. It's like we need to build the smart grids fast enough so that the efficiencies that they realize will save us from the carbon costs of building the smart grid that needs to sort of save us. It's like a snake eating its own tail in this regard. And this was sort of brought home to me, I guess, when I was on another panel with my friend Stanley Williams, who's at Hewlett Packard. And he had been on a commission by then Vice President Gore with this brief. What would it take to design a supercomputing system that can model the entire climate in real time? That's the idea. Go figure this out, how you could actually do that. And they figured out this would require orders of magnitude more computation that is even thought to exist going forward in this sort of one. Theoretically possible, but he was arguing that actually would probably require completely new materials and the rest of this work as well. But then just as an aside, he sort of made this little remark where he said, basically what we figured out was not only would this computer be about the size of Paris, but it itself would be the single most significant energy event that it itself would be modeling. That's the smart grid that we're sort of developing here as well. So, I forgot to sort of say, one thing I want to show is that this is the sort of scheme I sort of have. This earth layer is, again, where the energy comes from for all the rest of these kinds of things, and thinking about all the rest as well. There's also ways in which the energy and the structures of all this happen. In terms of politics, not only there's a politics of this, but it's generative of a kind of politics in its own way. We had a student in my lab who was working with Charlie Kennel and myself. She was here from Cambridge, and she was doing work in the Himalayas between India and Pakistan. And she was talking to me about how both countries put sensors in the snow up there in order to measure the snowpack, because it's a place where there's melting. And obviously the snow moves around a lot. And I was asking about the sort of jurisdictional issues, because of course the Pakistanis don't share the data with Indians, Indians don't share the data with Pakistani. And what she said was extraordinarily interesting, was that what happens is that the data that any one of those sensors, if it's a Pakistani sensor, and it might move with the glacier into Indian territory, the fact that it's generating that data, Pakistan makes a claim on the space below the sensor where it's actually generating the data, right? And India does the same thing. So it's like that we generated the data about that space, so that is our space so it moves around. So wherever the sensors move, the map moves around. But you have this extraordinary situation where the data isn't the representation of the sovereign claim. The data generates the sovereign claim in the first place. Yeah.
That's a clarification question. So is it important that it's a data generating token, or does it just matter that it's a token that moves and it marks space, and someone can say that was in Pakistan and what moves with that is in Pakistan?
It could be a token, I think, in this case. I think it's interesting that what's matter is it's not that the sensor moves, but that the data that the sensor generates, I think, is the condition of the claim. Or at least that is possible, because it allows you to think of other ways in which the ability to generate and monitor the sensor data would actually provide for the sovereign claim over whatever it is measured, right? As something associated to enact it, and sort of to make the sort of claim going forward. And there's other ways in which these complexities, of course, generate other kinds of weird sovereignties. There's the Association of Island States in the IPCC, where you've got this political actor, like sort of a geopolitical arrangement, right, that's acting at the level of a country within the IPCC, which is just a bunch of countries that happens to be near the equator. They have to be sort of low-lying states, but they're agglomerated as a kind of co-actors. The same thing happens on the production side, where you've got these weird alliances between Texas and Russia, because they're both oil producers. Okay? And this is this map that AMO made a few years ago about a re-subdivision of Europe, according not towards the Westphalian borders, but according to the kind of energy that each one of those produces. To the extent that in terms of climate governance, we see these sort of alignments of interest according to those who are producing energy and those who are the victims, let's say, of the energy that's produced in a certain way as an organizing logic for how it is that they have kind of coordinated political speech. Moving up to the cloud layer, we see these kinds of weird complexities sort of in terms of a more everyday level. There's all sorts of ways in which cloud systems are generatives of weird kinds of geography, of different forms of centralization and decentralization. And I've done a lot of research on the China-Google conflict, or the Sino-Google war of 2008 to the present going forward, because I see this really as not just a conflict between two kinds of proxy state actors, the People's Republican Army, People's Liberation Army versus people, but as a conflict between two very different logics of political geography. One, the Westphalian state circumscribed by land, and another, a kind of more diffuse, gossamer form of public economy and participation, that it isn't bound to this particular place, and yet still is taking on more and more roles for the state. And it's it's like one layer on top of another layer. I think going forward, I think you'll find ways in which Google will be in China, or it is in many ways, Android. That these two layers never really merge, not just between Google and China, but between this sort of distributed sovereignty and the grounded sovereignty going forward. Perhaps the most sort of, this is a patent that Google filed a few years ago for offshore data centers. And the idea was that they would use old drilling rigs and sort of stuff like that to put data centers outside national territorial waters, where there's obviously plenty of water for cooling and the rest of this as well. But beyond just pirate radio and sort of one-offs, the idea is the core infrastructure of the basic global economy situated outside of territorial waters, which is logic, suggests all kinds of weird and fantastic realignments of sovereign systems, especially when, and this is sort of the point, is that as platforms like Google take on increasingly more types of functions that used to be reserved for the state, legal identification, currency, cartography, as they become more like the states and as states become more like cloud platforms, those delaminations will become increasingly more important. Hilarious example of this was from a couple of years ago, where Google Maps accidentally, they shifted the border between Nicaragua and Costa Rica, and Nicaragua mobilized their army and tried to take the space that Google had given them. Part of Costa Rica to the beginning. If you think, and it all worked out okay. But if you think about the history of states as this cartographic mechanism of describing the territory upon which these things work, the fact that it gets flipped, and that the Google as a platform becomes sort of lower in the stack, so to speak, than the state itself, generating in terms of this territory. I mean, there's other examples of this in Dutchies, things that come to the rest of this, but I think this is kind of indicative of the types of things I'm talking about. With city systems and sort of layer, one of the things that I deal with a lot with this is the ways in which thinking of cities as agglomerations of different interfaces of different scales. And the ways in which those interfaces construct and interpolate different kinds of subject positions in relationship to them in different ways. And I'll talk about that for a second. What I'm not really talking about, though, even though the show about the hardware software stack, is the sort of smart city kind of things, where we understand it's entirely in terms of the ways in which we can view software into things, and how this will provide a kind of super rational macro vision, managerial transparency, and so forth and so on. The way in which these large consultancies are trying to sell this and understand cities as an engineering problem instead of a sort of social one. I think that there will be a future Jacques Tati movie about the IBM smart cities of the future going forward. But what I'm kind of more interested in, I guess, is in the ways in which these landscape or territorial scale interfaces produce forms of subjectivity irrespective of the formal sovereignties that might be given to them. So in two sort of quick examples of this, maybe you might recall the transporter immigrant tool from here, UCSD from a few years ago, where you can tell how old it is from the phones here. That the people walking across the desert from Mexico can use this GPS system to find the water caches that Good Samaritan groups have given them. And one of the interesting things about this is how it is that the interface and this mechanism and this instrument just deals with the user of the device as the user. The user is the user. The user is the position that it will work with. It doesn't care whether you are a citizen or not a citizen. It doesn't care whether you are anything other than this position. And the ways in which the interpolation of someone as user provides access to certain kinds of landscapes and territories and spaces that other forms of subjectification may not, and what the question of scalability of the user as a kind of cosmopolitan figure is of interest. At the same time, there's also ways in which we try to defeat this process. This was another fellow I spoke with, Leslie Julian Oliver. Julian does a lot of projects that essentially try to defeat those forms of subjectivization. This is a tank, but what the tank does is it sort of knocks out all of the GPS and 3G systems within the area of itself. So you put this somewhere, and any of the GPS and 3G systems just simply they just don't work. They're sort of scrambled. So it's the opposite of transporter immigrant tool, where you have people who are given a form of subjectivity within the network that they wouldn't have otherwise had. There's other ways in which one subtracts the subjectivity that you may already have back to a kind of invisibility for this as well. And it's the dynamic between these two that are kind of interesting. And of course, going forward post Snowden, a lot of these things will be more interesting. What's also interesting to me about these two things, the Julian's project and the transport immigrant tool, is that they both may be seen as kind of perfectly logical ways of dealing with a contemporary situation of planetary scale computation, but they're also both illegal. And so there's an idea of post-crimes, which sort of suggests that many of that there's a certain, as opposed to a kind of transgression, that there's a certain logic of behavior within a system that may at a given moment be illegal, but which is essentially a kind of what will scale into a normative behavior somewhere down the line, right? So file sharing generally is maybe illegal now, but it is essentially will become the normative system around which some other legal system will have to organize itself, right? It's sort of embryonically structured, embryonically legal in this way, and so forth. But there's all kinds of ways in which I think that we want to, I think this question of the opacity, transparency, subjectivization, desubjectivization in relation to these networks that's at work. Foucault's panopticon effect, that you don't know whether you're being observed. You don't know whether you're being surveilled. You have to behave as if you were anyway. I think what we have now, especially sort of post-Snowden, is more like an inverse panopticon, where we know we're being observed and surveilled, but we act like we're not. And sort of exhibitionism in that faith. So another thing I'll just go through real quickly here, sort of a project I became interested in, was sort of moving things to Foucault's disciplinary society, Deleuze-controlled society. I'm interested in the ways in which of skin and the sort of epidermal logic of governance. You remember this after the Boston bomber was found not by observing him or finding him or tracing his cell phone, but by the heat signature of his body underneath this boat as well. It's got me thinking a lot about the way in which skin can sort of be designed in here as well. And so this is the nano-engineering project, which I'll show real quickly. This was a collaboration with Joseph Wang's group over in nano-engineering. And he had developed this ink with the Navy that senses the particulate matter of explosives in like a parts per trillion sensitivity. So the Marines go into the space, and if there's an IED there, it will go bing, and they can know not to go in here. But the ink is just the ink, right? So the first thing we think, well, the ink could go under skin, and the skin itself becomes the sensory mechanism. And we can augment and extend the logics of what skins can sense according to these kinds of inks, so forth. So, and this also happened. This also happened to happen around the time of the mass shooting in Massachusetts, where at the elementary school, and begin thinking about finding explosives or inhibitions in a public space and what might sort of work with this as well. And for that, I was thinking about how there's a kind of, the dense layers and anonymity of a crowd is what gives it its vulnerability in those sorts of situations where you fire into anything that isn't wrong. So what we developed with this was a sort of version of these that would sense the similar chemicals to those other emissions of guns that had recently gone off. And so if you have one of these things, it will sense that a gun had been fired in somewhere in the proximity of this. And so the whole crowd becomes a kind of distributed sensor mechanism. And of course, 2 is for Second Amendment and the idea that maybe the way to deal with these issues is not about subtraction of people's guns, which would be maybe good but very difficult, but rather kind of counter weaponization of the target in this as well. So more to discuss around this epidermal biopolitics. The next layer up is address. And this is a map we made based on some data from up in the Supercomputing Center of IPv4 space. This is, and as you know, all the addresses for IPv4 have already been allocated to these RIRs. I didn't know what RIRs were before we did this project, but this is what they are. There's these regional areas that get the address and allocate them. And then on the top left here are all these other companies that got blocks of 6 million early on. GE, Xerox, HP, MIT, Apple, DuPont. And then there's this guy, a beard there, who's actually here at UCSD. Supposedly is used for internet radio, but most everyone knows it's darknet or some sort. So, at any rate, the point is that the space is full. And the space wasn't very big to begin with. There's only about a theoretical 3-some billion addresses in IPv4 space in the first place. With 7 billion or so people in the world, this doesn't really work out, even with dynamic mapping. So one of the solutions that's come with is IPv6, of course, and that, this in a certain sense may change a lot of things if it becomes properly IPv6 is a 128-bit address string. If you divide this 3 million people to 7 billion, 3 billion to 7 billion for IPv4, 128-bit address string works out to about 10 to the 23 addresses per person. 10 to the 23, right? Which is very, very large number. It is much more than number of stars. That the number of stars we even actually sort of know about. But in terms of the idea of as a basis of ubiquitous computing, it begs the it sort of boggles the mind and extends the conception of ubiquity in some very interesting kinds of ways. So if you just as a thought experiment, you wanted to assign a unique address to every single thing you ever came in contact with over the course of your life, everyone gets an IP address. What it's going to say to everything else, we don't know, we don't care, we're going to give one to everything. You would never, ever, ever use up 10 to the 23, right? It's not just like every letter on every piece of paper. It's like the molecules in the letter on every piece of paper, kind of degree of granularity for this as well. So in a certain sense, there's never any way in which you could use up that level. And this was a project we did with the Nano 3 lab over here, just me trying to think about the scale of this as well, using their old version of their electron lithography to write out an IPv6 address as small as it's possible to write, given their nice technology. So this is about 10 micrometers across, which is roughly the width of a red blood cell. And each one of these lines is about 140 nanometers. Now Bear just got a much smaller one, so we can go much smaller as well. Still, you could fit in this space. If you wanted to assign an address to equally distribute all the possible IPv6 addresses over the surface of the Earth, including I did all these calculations. Over the surface of the Earth, one address per microspace. The unit of space that you would need this by is orders of magnitude smaller than even this. And so there you go. But so never on one end. But the other, I think, interesting design question around addressability for IPv6, just as a kind of conceptualization, is that you can also assign addresses not to discrete things, but to relations between things. Right? So this glasses can have an address, but the fact that it is my glass could have an address. The fact that it is my glasses on today can have an address. The fact that the plastic in these glasses came from a certain reserve in Venezuela can have an address, and so forth and so on. Like all the relations of relations of relations of relations that constitute this object can have individual addresses as well. And if you sort of think of the exponential growth of those relations of relations of relations, all turtles all the way down, you could use up 10 to the 23 instantaneously if you go all the way to the abyss. So somewhere between never and instantaneously is the design space of what this project called deep address. This is for here as well. There's the picture of this. Okay, interface. This as well. I define interfaces a little bit differently. Part of it has to do with the time I spent in architecture school. For me, interfaces would be defined as any point of contact between two complex systems, which governs the condition of exchange between those systems as that interface, right? That's the sort of thing. So the buttons certainly do this to networks, but, and we have particular ways in which we do this. The condensation of the affordances of particular systems and networks into semiotic images that we do for it is a particular our way of putting one brick on top of another brick in terms of the modalities of this. But at the same time, physical things can be interfaces too. Interfaces that prevent movement, that prevent connection, are just as much interfaces as ones that enable them. Hard, big things are interfaces, as well as small, soft things are interfaces. And so one of the things I was writing about, this is another part of extending this discussion with Don Norman having, is thinking about a kind of general theory of interfaces. Or that's maybe too grandiose, it is too grandiose. But some time ago I wrote this piece where I started beginning to think about, if there's ways in which we could think about the interfacial quality of something, less in terms of what it is, like it's a button, it's a door, it's a wall, then in terms of what kind of interfacial performance it has. Is it slowing things down or speeding things up? Is it disclosing something about a network or hiding something about a network? The things that are big, small, heavy, or weight can do all those things, regardless of the type of thing that they are. Because something has to come to a state of interfaciality for it to be an interface. The little J on my keyboard, the little plastic key, is not by itself an interface. It's only when it's embedded in here, and connected to an operating system, and connected to it, then does it become an interface. So, some interfaces work because they're mobile, some because they're immobile. Some are kind of static image forms, and some are dynamic image forms. Some work synchronously or asynchronously. For some, there's a symmetrical relationship between the two users. Some is asymmetrical, like a jail door. It's an asymmetrical interface between the two users. Some are, iconic and indexical. Some are designed for singular users, and some for plural users. Some operate in a sort of state of unactivatedness, and then once you use them, they become active. Some are signifying or asignifying. Some are opaque or transparent, instantaneous or cumulative. Cumulative interface would be like this. I think it was Santiago Serra, but I may be wrong. Project that was some time ago where there was this huge piano suspended in the atrium of a gallery, like a giant piano suspended like above the floor. And all these pianos, it's also connected to a rope, and then there's this huge saw right on the rope. And every time someone comes into the museum and turns the turnstile, the saw moves one line. And over the period of days, you would know it was Sarah. I don't know if this is anyway, over the period of days, it then sort of came crashing down, but it took many days. This is a cumulative interface, as opposed to a doorknob, which is sort of instantaneous. So anyway, so in the consulting world, I use this as a kind of diagnostic model for certain kinds of client processes. Trying to figure out, like, right now, these are mobile, dynamic, synchronous, asymmetrical, iconic, plural, signifying, transparent, and instantaneous interfaces. But you want them to be immobile, asynchronous, and so forth and so on and on. And then you can have a kind of medium agnostic way of thinking about the system, where it's not about it's going to be software, it's going to be hardware. You can think about what are the kinds of interfacial properties you want that are happening versus what you want to have happen, and then you can figure it out from there. Which would suggest that the interface design, at least a few different things. One is the sort of way in which you design all those conditions of things coming together, designing the conditions of assembly. That is, the design of the subway system itself is a kind of interface design in parts of the city. We design images of those assemblages with the map, and then we design also we design image instruments of those assemblages. Images that when you click them, cause something else to happen down the line in the world. So, diagrams that are, by which this process is grouped. Yeah, please.
Is there an in-principle difference between the interface and the platform?
Yes. Yeah, there is. Interfaces, I think, the way in which I would think interfaces are points of entry into platforms, is the way in which I think. There's certainly interfaces to things that are not platforms. for one, right? So the interfaces is sort of I would think of a kind of a horizontal structure. All kinds of things are interfaces to things that aren't platforms. Whereas platforms, in terms of the way they cohere into a kind of structure, they still come in contact with things in the outside world, or things within themselves. Those themselves are interfaces. Between the layers in platforms, we may call these protocols, which to the extent to which they're more specific kinds of plots, scripts that actually adjudicate the movement up and down. Because of their standardization, that modularity might work for this as well. But I would reserve, and then at least in the way my little schema here, the interface is actually a layer in this larger structure. But that's because I'm sort of talking about something more specifically. But yeah, that would be the range. So users, what are users? One way, if you do a kind of history of the idea of the user, there's not as much as you think there might be. It's perhaps the Dreyfus's Joe and Josephine, kind of ergonomic, hyper-medium people from are sort of one kind of user. The idea that we're going to model and standardize the hypothetical agent within this system, understand their requirements, technical, cultural, psychological, and then construct the system in relationship to that fiction is, to a certain extent, that's a persona. But the users, in a way, are kind of divulged in relationship to this kind of thing. It's a certain kind of an instrumentalization of participation. It's certainly useful as an idea in and of itself. I think what's interesting, though, is how it's actually become not just a way of describing the way people actually do things, it's become a model for personhood in the first place, or a model for identity and subjectivity in the first place. And maybe the whole quantified self movement is a kind of a clear example of this, how a rendering of oneself as a user of one's own body, as a user of the world, as a user in an epidemiological context, but of all sort of contingent sense of self as this performance matrix and so forth and so on, that this coherency the user provides here as well. The problem, though, for this, not for me, but for them to a certain degree, is that within the quantified self structure, there's a kind of paradox at work, in that initially, the more data you get about yourself, the more the mirror reflection of the world back to you, the more intense it becomes. Perhaps the greater degree of faith in the fiction of a coherent self you may have. You may become to believe that you actually exist with a greater degree of specificity than you actually do. And there's a bit of relate perhaps to Lacan in the mirror stage, where you get tricked by the outline of the body to think the subject is whole. But this is probably also why a lot of the quantified self is so, there's a lot of enthusiastic followers among those who, taken by an X-Men reading of Atlas Shrugged, that this individuation of self is the sort of key thing. The problem, though, is that once you layer more and more and more and more data on top of these performance metrics, weather data, epidemiological data, other forms of systemic data, you become, in a way, to sort of see yourself less as an individuated unit and more as a kind of node within a lot of crisscrossing currents, both above and below the human scale. You kind of get the envelope of self begins to perforate and evaporate, and there's the process by which it initially sort of makes a hypertrophic self and then dissipates itself somewhere down the line. Like this. And now, one of the other ways I think I'm sort of thinking about in terms of how do you pull something in and out of the user layer, not just other people, but other kinds of things besides humans. It's, we see this all around. We all, sort of things that we sort of know about that. More traffic on the internet is generated by bots and other sorts of non-human users than by users. When we're talking about things like Google driverless car, who I went to go visit these guys recently. Very interesting stuff that you're doing. Who's the user here? Is it the person is the user of the car? Yes, to a degree. The car, however, is really more the user of the city. And this is what the car is to sort of become the user. And to the extent to which you've got multiple cars all nested together and linked in a kind of daisy chain as they move along the freeway, they become co-users of a kind of larger aggregate assemblage. They told me this amazing story I just like to share with you, that among the sort of legal challenges that they have to deal with, not just with cities, they're also dealing with these guys from the Gun Owners of America, which is a group I think a little bit to the specifically to the right to the NRA. who are comparing a legal challenge to the potential law that would prevent people from driving, to prevent you from driving a human-driven car. By arguing that a human-driven car is a kind of munition, that there's a machine that it is essentially protected by the Second Amendment. And that to take away someone's right to drive this machine is like taking away the right to use those other sort of machines. So, anyway, there's that.
So do they agree with, in some ways, is there political theory and your political theory about designs creating new kinds of political sites maybe aligned in that sense?
Oh yeah, for sure. Now, I always think that in a general sense, if you look at like sort of paranoid right-wing conspiracy theory about what they think the left is doing, it's always much better than what the left is actually doing. So it's a good place to look for ideas. Glenn Beck's Agenda 21 is fantastic. As a sort of like, yeah, for sure. No doubt. So the current book that I'm reading, again, is on robotics. And sort of, how am I for time though? So let me show you how.
We like to have about a half an hour discussion, so I don't know how far.
I went from, so I should wrap it up. Oh, I should wrap it up. Okay. I'm going to sort of skip through this stuff because I do want to have the discussions of, okay, non-human users. Okay, it's going to be weird for people to think about, shifting humans out of the way in some sort of way. We'll be living with all kinds of synthetic species. The Turing test won't matter, won't help. The idea of thinking about synthetic intelligence in terms of the way in which humans think about how humans think, what we ultimately thought of as a kind of, that's the Turing test, as a kind of vestigial racism. And then we've got Deborah's robot here, where I was going to say, I'm going to say, where I would sort of say something about that the problem, I think, in this encounter with synthetic intelligence also has to do with this sense of that when it comes online and when it becomes sapient, that it will care a lot about what humans are and do. It will either want to kill us, like Terminator, or want to be like us, like AI. The fact is, it probably won't care about us at all, and I think that's, in a way, the more scary part, that we just don't really matter that much. We're irrelevant, that we're not something to even know, is maybe the more difficult thing to sort of consider. Okay, so I'm going to, just because I do want to have the discussion, I'm going to try to go through this super, super quick. There's just some thoughts on design at UCSD. Some of the original maps of California originally had California as an island. And I think they may have had it right in the first place. I think we should go back to this sort of model. David Kirsch and I in the back did a fair bit of research about how we might get this going, to think about this. And one of the things we figured out with this is that if you do the map of this sort of space of design schools between schools that focus on highly disciplinary or interdisciplinary education, or highly research-oriented versus professional education, there's a nice open space in the research interdisciplinary space that we might sort of go into. But it's certainly an open question about this relation, how design school pedagogy and research university platforms might work together. And there's lots of different models. Some work well, some don't, not so well. Harvard, Carnegie Mellon, Stanford are all totally different from each other. But it's an open question, and we want to sort of do this. And one of which we're thinking is how we merge the semanticological idea of design and this institutional instrumentological design into something itself. When Frieder Seibel was here, he had this whole idea of the SME building as the new Bauhaus that he was going for. And he didn't mean it this way, but the Bauhaus, I think of the Bauhaus as essentially a function of the development of industrial chemistry. There's all these new materials we can make things with. We can remake the whole world according to the industrial replicability of all these sort of materials. And say we're going back to the early 20th century. I didn't go for Italian futurism over the Bauhaus, despite the fact they all kind of ran into the bullets in World War I. Or Soviet space, the imagery from the Soviet space race, which is among the most fantastic sort of findings as well. So this is where I think we're going, not the Bauhaus. I want to say quickly a couple words on the idea of speculative design, which comes up again. Within architecture, the way in which, for example, Dunn and Raby have dealt with speculative design in architecture, yeah, it's what we've been doing for 40 years. And I would really suggest anyone who's interested in the history of the speculative design district to look at the experimental and sort of avant-garde architectural projects from the 50s and 60s. And because there's such an enormously range of material here as well. One point to make about speculative design, or the idea of design as a way of sort of having a larger vision as well. Also, just as a bit of homework, CNN did this design competition right after 9/11, where asking regular people to design their own things, and just go there. And they have bazillions and bazillions and bazillions of entries. These are one of my favorites here as well. There's a couple other pretty great ones too as well. But the idea of design as a medium for kind of speculative imagination about how it is that we would need to cohere a kind of rotation of a different kind of political or social situation is not an elite undertaking. It's in fact, it certainly is a highly populist one. So what can we do here? Look, we have some amazing biology, put this in school as well. So just a couple of 2 or 3 projects. So bio-encryption, store millions of gigabytes of data bacteria, true. From Gunnar Raby's nanotechnology studio, growing eyelashes very, very long. So we could do this, research fashion, proposed. Laura Splain's flesh pillows, proposed. These are, it's prototype. They're not actually flesh. It's just high resolution scans of her skin printed on cotton. But when you hold them like this, you have this relationship to them. Born in Yona cats, pig wings, where they cultured the stem cells of pigs into these little wings. They're like pigs fly, growing flesh. True. Bacteria inside concrete that grows into the gaps within the concrete as Encryption breaks, making it more stable. True. Revital Cohen phantom limb recorder, where it will record the sensations of the phantom limb. It's a new terminology. Not true. I forget you guys. Oh, and here Tashimoto's assist exoskeleton for people who would otherwise be in a single wheelchair, allow them to sort of get up and walk around. True. So it's sort of between as well. So last night, sort of thinking about this, you have to have an A/B list for this as well. Maybe one way to think about the kind of design where things are going in that earlier sort of model I talked about to a certain extent from and to things are going. This may be a good place to just to think about and start and to think about. I'll come back to this and put this on for our discussion just for help with this. But I just want to say one thing. All of this critique of the corporate models, I think, it's not in name of some kind of resolute humanism. I'm actually not that interested in have a whole lot of faith in humans as such. It's not on their behalf that I think it needs to go. But it is one of the things that I'm really concerned about with a lot of the design innovation discourse is this idea, again, that sort of everything can change as long as everything stays the same. And I don't think this is where we want to sort of work with this as well. One of the good news and bad news of the Anthropocene, the bad news is that we've screwed up the planet in this way, but the good news is we've proved that geo-engineering is actually possible. We've done it once, and now we simply need to do it better. But it also begs the idea of what the post-Anthropocene would be. That's the next geologic era. Werner Benjain told me thinks Anthropocene will be the shortest geologic era ever. What comes next? We don't really know, but the only thing would be defined by the post-Anthropocene is that humans would no longer be the dominant species as a geologic subject agent. And maybe that's the goal. One word on speculative design is I think it has less to do with sort of optimizing technologies as we have it than it has to do with reframing the possibilities of those technologies as well, which suggests that the ideas of usefulness and usability are extremely limited. We can have highly usable viruses. We can have extremely usable interfaces to slave auctions. We can have extremely useful and usable things that are totally noxious. Usability and usefulness is overrated in terms of evaluating the structures here as well. Okay, so last sort of word, in terms of the noise and signal thing that Scott brought up, another way of thinking about this is that Virilio has this nice line where he says that the invention of any new technology is also the invention of a new kind of accident. The invention of the car is the invention of the car crash, the invention of the stock market is the invention of the stock market crash, and so on. So all of these things are implied, they have accidents built into them. And it may be, however, that the accidents that they generate are actually the real design outcome. It may be that what was not intended by the technology is the thing that we want to derive from it. Which is to say that, does that make sense? Which is to say that in the same time, the invention of any new accident is also the invention of a new technology. Yeah. Okay, so that's what I wanted to share with you today. What's that?
Do you want to call your own questions?
Yeah, whatever you like.
Can you put your prompt?
Yes, I'll put this up. Oh, I'm sorry, what was this? Design does its best work in relationship to emergencies. It's not when we have a clean slate, but we actually have to do something really right now. So fortunately, we've got lots of emergencies, climatic, security, reputational. So pick your emergency, I guess. So I don't necessarily want this to be the focus of the conversation, but just as it may be, just as I can't possibly ask you to read it so fast, I'll think about it. Okay, so as you were first.
Well, I feel bad. I'm the organizer, so I'll talk to you.
Everyone wants to go second. So if you go first, then they get to go second.
Okay, well, I have like 9 questions. So, okay, question number 1 is, you talked about inventing new technologies, inventing new kind of accidents.
Yeah, that's a real problem.
Yes, and maybe that's what we want, is the accidents.
I'm saying is that oftentimes it's the accidents that actually end up being the more interesting and useful outcome of the design intervention than the intention. And so purification of systems to prevent all noise is a bad idea. For example, like if you think of medicine as a platform, the idea that error in medicine is disincentivized to report errors means the system can't learn in real time.
Right.
So the accidents are actually how to learn.
So it's not a problem with it. So I was just wondering what the role of if so much of the discourse of design, and I'm not sure I see an alternative in your talk, is centered around the idea of intention, the Anthropocene, maybe some kind of intentional interaction with the world. So I was wondering how that went along with what do you do with these accidents in a more
for us is putting one brick on top of one brick. There's a question of intention. But there's a difference. Like one way to differentiate, I think, logic of platforms from, say, master plans. Is that plans assume you're going to fix everything in place, you understand the structure and outcome, and you have this kind of master control over everything, right? Masdar, IBM Smart City. We're going to encapsulate everything into this structure, and therefore we will modulate and all risk in their purposes. It's a very different idea than a platform such as I don't know, Google AdWords or something, where we're just going to set a term or an urban grid. We're going to put in place a kind of mechanism that will coordinate and organize the self-directed actions of people that we can't anticipate, but we'll set it up in such a way that their participation in this system will increase in value for them to the extent to which it's mediated through through this system. Right? It's a kind of setting up in terms of a generative, setting up the system as something that will grow, as opposed to something that can be developed in sort of counter-simulation of itself.
So is that just like saying you can still capitalize on your accidents? Is this like a logic of capitalism that can absorb all of its contradictions? I know I just asked that.
No, fine. I have no problem. Yeah, I mean, to me, capitalism is a lot of different things.
Maybe metaphorically.
Because it's a lot of different things, and it's not. It's very difficult to talk about it monolithically. At the same time, there's a. Marx's basic logic is that it's an extremely dynamic process, it's a system, and it has a this is part of what it does. So this re-encapsulation is perhaps part of it. But there's another sort of logic by which certainly the infrastructural systems have to reach a certain degree of ubiquity that they become essentially have no exchange value, and that is the precondition of socialism or communism and all the rest of it. So yes, there's a whole argument about post-scarcity that I can begin with this as well. But yes, platforms capture to no degree. Google capture. There's a way in which platforms centralize and agglomerate and lean towards winner-take-all economies. There's no doubt. Yes, and that's a problem of their politics for sure. Yeah.
I guess I have a question about the main chunk of your talk when you were talking about platforms and stacks. I was hearing it very much kind of like a grand theory. Like you kind of are covering so much, right? And I feel like the way you're doing that is by using some very big abstractions like platforms, user interface, and then this can be an interface, this can be an interface, or platform can be used to describe each of these layers. They're just kind of different scales or something like that. And I guess I'm wondering what limitations you think of such a broad theory could be, and especially I think when you start getting into it, seem to have a lot of nuance and you differentiate a lot. But I guess I kind of worry, much like the way that business books get used, that people kind of run with them and just try to everything looks like a platform, or everything looks like a user interface. You know what I mean? Like, how, are you worried about people taking your theory because it's so abstract and just kind of like looking at the world completely that way? And I guess the more kind of the kind of political question would be like, what is missing from your theory? Like, what, you know, all theories only get some part of the picture. What is not going to be kind of brought into view if we look at the world through this platform-centric kind of way?
Okay, thanks. It's an excellent question, but two different ones. I mean, on a certain degree, yes. I mean, I'm suggesting this, again, in I think a sort of schema that's essentially metaphorical, and something that a metaphor is a schema, as a kind of, this is the image of totality. This is a total, this is a total image to presume here, and its limitations are the limitations of any of those kinds of gestures, right? In any sort of way, when they become, they have a brittleness and a tendency to try to smush things that don't actually fit with models or things like this as well. So that, I think that's sort of table stakes for talking about these kinds of things. The question is just whether or not it's worth that. And I think there's, the argument that Sip's making is the reason I think it is because I think there's more that can be, instead of thinking about all these different processes and structures operating at different geographic scales, different political scales, different temporal scales, as a bunch of different forms of computational speciation, to understand them as a kind of accidental megastructure may allow for a kind of composability of this mechanism that wouldn't have been able to happen otherwise. There may be a way to leverage more things at once by thinking about them in this way. There's other discourses of megastructures and the rest of this that can be thought into this as well. But there's also an argument that, like, yes, I think we need to be thinking about, we need to be thinking in terms of megastructures. I think we need to be thinking about speculative infrastructure in terms of systems and how this will be working around, and to understand the ways in which these would be stabilized. It's also useful for me, like, to back to Scott's point, is that there's certain ways in which it renders each one of these sort of points or sites by, I think, highlighting different things that may have at first appeared to be noisy, significant, and demonstrating that they're in fact perhaps normative or generative of other sorts of other kinds of thinking as well. Yeah, I mean, in terms of it getting picked up like business school stuff, I mean, in a certain way, it's probably inevitable in a certain way. I mean, but I've seen this happen in both directions. I mean, like after I gave this TED Talk thing, I got like one thing I liked about the reaction to this talk was that every line got quoted. It wasn't like one key line over and over. I mean, there was one, but it was mostly every line. I mean, somebody pulled different things out of it about this as well, which I think is good. But there was a lot of misinterpretation of sort of something that's going on with this.
That's where your terminology is actually coming from the business community. Like platforms, like a lot of these terms are actually coming from, and I think you're then theorizing them and giving them a more, robust.
Well, platform actually comes from, if you want to get really technical about it, it would actually come from theater and dance. If you wanted to pick it,
but I mean the way that you're using it.
Because it moves up, because it's a derivation of the stage, of the platform.
But the way it's been applied to like Facebook.
Within economics and political theory, there's certainly the movement interests. Yeah, but I want to argue, but it mostly, I mean, probably more strongly in computer science. That OSI is a platform, TCP is a platform. We're going to structure APIs in such a way that they will have platform effects by which they sort of work. The history of these things goes back in a particular kind of way. But yes, I'm trying to argue that this is, we can abstract this as a technical model into an institutional model backwards and forward. The fact that people in the economics department and political science department are talking about these things doesn't scare me at all. In fact, they're doing some interesting work around this as well. Donald McKenzie is his work on stock markets. It's fantastic stuff.
Well, some of the species that I'm not seeing here, in that are really good examples, is, for example, bureaucracy. The systems we deal with every day, which is shifting and evolving in politics. So if you say that will the future robots care about us, it's already happened. Does bureaucracy care about us? In other words, these complex systems don't need to be something labeled as artificial intelligence. They're systems that are already in place, that are already a great deal of problems.
Yeah.
And they're concrete, they have names.
I would differentiate bureaucracies and platforms rather than when you differentiate master plans. And the bureaucracies working backwards from the guaranteed specific outcomes. If you want something to happen, you go to the form in which this sort of
But
works.
it's
It's a different organizational mechanism of cause and effect, and one that's strongly different from the way in which platforms work. But your basic point is like, yeah, there's no doubt that as robotics and other forms of intelligence actually become part of our life, they'll stop being called robots, they'll stop being called AI, they become called cars, ways we call husband.
We already have robots giving tickets. Yes, they're in the form of human flesh, but the role of robots, for example, issuing a citation, is already implemented.
I see. Well, see, I give robots more credit than they have. I don't see the phase space of the kind of social psychology of robotics as one that is quite so authoritarian and Taylorist as this as well. Robots get a bad rap in that regard.
So I want to ask you if you could talk a little more about the relationship between platforms. In the last bit of your talk about speaking to design, because the way in which I see them, platforms are kind of at odds, or can be easily at odds with the exercise of the speculative design that you have pointed at the end. But I think that you think they are compatible in a way, right? So can you explain how platforms can actually be a platform for speculative design?
Yes, well, because, part of it is that, that's what we mean by speculative design.
Well, whether you
in
say
terms of the same, but part of it has to do with, stacks are a particular kind of platform. There's lots of platforms that are not stacks. I'm talking about a particular stack of the platform. And I'm not advocating for platforms as the sort of, as the master wrench that's going to solve all of these problems, but rather identifying their emergence as a fundamental form of our geopolitical self-organization and demanding that we need a better theory of these things as opposed to thinking them out in different sorts of ways. I would never be pro-platform any more than be pro-governments or pro-calcium, right? It's a sort of process that sort of works sort of as well. They're all pharmacological in their process, right? But stacks have the additional capacity of their layer-by-layer modularity. There's something that can get pulled out and put back in a certain way. And I don't mean literally that everything's going to become stack models and tensor models and all kinds of things as well. But it just is a heuristic structure. This is at least one place in which speculative design gets traction. Is that many more things can be inserted into these levels as long as they can interoperate with the level above them and below them, so to speak. They're just as good as any other thing that might go in there. And so there are certain kinds of perhaps normative barriers that would disallow a certain participation or inclusion or realm of possibility would be fully capable of operating and working. So I think it may constrain the phase space of possibilities to its relationship with other things in certain sort of ways, but I don't think it forecloses it. I don't think it forecloses it at all. I can imagine a scenario in which it would not foreclose it at all, and I can certainly imagine one in which it would.
It was just the first time of your answer to respond to the question.
But
it was heuristic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you understand? I didn't want to satisfy your answer of where in which speculative design might fit into a kind of platform logic. Do you at least see the possibility of that?
Yeah.
Good. And yes, it's not pro-platform. It's Scott.
So I wanted to follow up on Fernando's question about speculative design. And when I was a kid and I saw something I didn't understand, I'd ask my dad and I'd say, "Hey, Dad, what's that?" And he would say, "It's a question maker," which I think is pretty awesome as an answer. And it also, I think, is a lot of what speculative design is doing. That if you take the opportunities for bioengineering or something like that, which seem really abstract, and then all of a sudden you render it as giant eyebrows, then that's kind of a question maker. And so, do you see speculative design as a real, as kind of the key actor in what research universities ought to be doing with design, or what is speculative design's relationship with other stuff? It's been a funny kind of, it's a really interesting genre, and it's hard to figure out what its home or role is.
It changes a lot. There's a lot of aspects of it that I've written super critical of certain aspects of, particularly running the AB model for it as well. So again, it's not an advocacy more than a sort of position of this as well. And there's certain things in it that, yes, I think would be extraordinarily appropriate for a place like this. I wouldn't in any say that this is the model for how design should be done in a research university to court anywhere in the world at a certain point. It's just not the way research is, the division of labor of research is divided up in there anyway. That it's more about consortiums and links between different forms of research in different locations that can link them together in some way. There isn't a one-size-fits-all version of this. It wouldn't work at Stanford the same way it would work here. Part of the reason I think that it's of interest here in a certain way is that, you know, when David and I were doing our research for the schools, and we go to the schools and say, what are designers been working with in 20 years? What would be the cool topics of design working with in 20 years? We can answer like biotech, nanotech, neuroscience, ecological structures as well. And we'd love to do that stuff. We just don't have access to those labs, so we have to kind of make it up. We kind of make it up in our heads. Right? We have access to that stuff, so we can make it up in our heads and play with it at the same time. And that's an extra. I think that's a really interesting possibility as well. We also don't have a design school, and we will never have a design school. And I think that's also an advantage because we don't have to be set up and say, okay, here's how we do it. And here's the structure that doesn't work. And here's these atelier models, and here's I mean, it can be remade in a lot of different ways. And this relationship between studio and laboratory, which we continue to negotiate, this juncture can be the basis of a third kind of space. It's neither one of these in and of itself that I think would be possibly unique. So those, you know, it's a quick answer to your question. I think those are the key other things. But no, I wouldn't recommend that everywhere as well. And yes, there's a lot of things about the way speculative design has been constructed that I'm super critical of. Yes, Deb?
So when I sit here and listen, I find myself thinking, whenever you have someone who's working in a human activity kind of generated thing, they start to describe parts of it and how it works. The closer it gets to what an ecologist has to do when he goes out to look at an ecosystem, any field ecologist, then it starts to get interesting. And it was interesting that one of your last things was that accidents are part of the system that needs to learn, right?
About the medicines, my example of medicine. Yeah.
So any ecologist who wants to describe something would end up doing that. And then the things that ecologists are talking about now, niche construction and organism-environment interactions, there's almost like the richness. So I want to ask you if any people are looking to ecology as a place to even say, oh, what else do I need to think about? So what are the mutations, and what are bacteria doing, and what are
there are, but never enough. And there's certainly a lot of conscious ways in which ecology incorporates terminologies and concepts and perspectives from other disciplines. It makes it an image of the aggregate whole, but it has its own terms and technologies which can be abstracted, however metaphorically or directly, but for other sorts of ways as well. I would certainly be all for that. The image, I mean, you're talking about an image of ecology as essentially a kind of unfolding system that gives itself, gives us some kind of order at multiple scales, as opposed to some kind of precious homeostatic whole. That kind of neo-creationist.
Or it stumbles on itself, and that's how it gets. But
neo-creationist view of ecology, and I think the earlier stumbling model is much more interesting. So,
and you get to platforms and stacks when there's enough stability in the type of system that it could then be replaceable. I was thinking about my own experience where I came from behavioral ecology and resistance. When evolutionary thinkers think about design or they think about reverse engineering, I have a very strong urge to say, no, evolution is not like design. There isn't an intentionality there. And then when I got to work with designers, and I thought, okay, now I'm going to understand intentional design, and things just happen, right?
Yeah. So, intentionality is different. There's some interesting stuff in philosophy of engineering on platforms as well. William and other people. I mean, there's an argument to be made that things like the tetrahedral diagram is a kind of platform, in the sense in which it provokes the conditions by which all kinds of other things get structured away from it, right? I mean, you can find platforms. You really want to make the case, and I don't think it needs to be evangelical about it, but there's ways in which those logics can be seen in
Like hexagons of nature.
What he calls generative entrapment.
Yeah.
Early on in the development cycle, there's ways in which the range of possibilities gets fixed in some sort of way, and the opportunity cost of doing anything else gets higher and higher and higher and higher and higher. This is an evolutionary principle as much as a financial.
I think we have time for one more question, and then people can stick around and chat informally.
Was there someone before me or?
I don't know, go for it.
Okay. So you seem to be saying, using the terms platform and master plan somewhat differently, but I didn't quite get the distinction.
Sure.
But I wanted to get back to the OSI model
Yeah.
and use that as an example.
Okay.
So that essentially came from the communications world, not so much as the internet world.
Yes, the networking model for sure. Yeah.
And since that thing got in place, there were lots of people who were very strong stakeholders in each of the layers.
Yep.
And when the cell phone platform started coming up, most of the innovations were at the bottom of the layer or at the application layer. But there is so much reluctance to change any of this. So what I'm getting at is this example that you said about medicine, trying to learn from mistakes. The moment you say platform or some of the nice SAT words that you're using, people tend to get fixated on that. There is lots of reluctance to go back and change things because then you will have stakeholders. So if you had a mechanism to learn from mistakes in a platform or whatever you do so that you're able to quickly improve upon things, then you might end up with a more stable system than either defining the platform or a master plan. So any thoughts on that?
Yes, a fantastic question. So first of all, I'll sort of begin by saying the different master plans or bureaucracies I would differentiate is basically their function is to sort of guarantee, is to fix outcomes and to support backwards from this, and to reduce and mitigate the possibility of error. That they understand that an ideal their optimized state is one in which error is great.
You're saying that doesn't apply to the IPv4, IPv6?
Of course it does. So I'm not at all saying, like, look how great OSI is. If we look at the history of the OSI system and how it's been implemented, if we just did everything like OSI, everything would be fine. It's not in the least what I'm sort of saying. It's just, in a way, I'm using it as a kind of, it's a diagrammatic logic. It's a sort of way in which we can see a particular diagram of stacks where you have an agent that initiates an action that goes all the way down the stack, and then all the way back up the stack to another agent over here. And it's those kinds of diagrammatic logics that I want to sort of question and ask how much they may work with this as well. But it's not a turning OSI into a kind of heroic mechanism that we just work as well. But the way in which you describe the problem of stakeholders and inertia within any particular layers is extremely interesting and telling. I think it has to do with is exactly the right kind of design problem we should be thinking about. How do you dislodge unnecessary inertia at layers within these mechanisms in such a sort of way in which these systems can continue to evolve? If these were the questions we were asking, as opposed to will it meet the needs of these 5 personas, or should it be orange or red, these sorts of things, then we would be in much better shape than we are now. But the real-time learning, I'm happily working with a doctor on this, about this sort of question, this platformization question, and we came up on the idea of the error correction. Platforms have to have a built-in error correction mechanism that works right, and in terms of this issue of best practice and other kinds of things, that incentivizing that error correction. But at the same time, and this maybe go to Deborah's argument a little bit, is that the systems as they grow, they don't, the correction can be in real time, but it can also be highly delayed. There may be a way in which those errors have to reach a certain threshold. Until they actually pass that threshold, then they can correct back onto the system. And in certain ways, those may be greater providers of stability and optimization. So where those thresholds get set in terms of that recursion is also an enormously important design question as well.
All right, well, thank you so much.